Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to week 6. We are finishing up Germany today, and then we shall jump headlong into Japan. A few announcements, maybe we can call them that. You have a discussion topic for Japan dealing with the birth rate problem. There is an online reading that you're doing for this particular topic. The discussion isn't due until next week, but I just wanted to give you a heads up. Also, your first midterm is due next week, and we will be talking more about that. I'll have some things to say. The assignment sheet is very detailed. Please make sure that you read it carefully. The question actually is very easy if you know what to look for. And what I've tried to do is lay out in that detailed assignment sheet what you should be looking for. The second midterm deals with collective identity. We'll talk about that much later. But of course, collective identity has also been a topic within really all of our countries so far. And I will be talking about collective identity in Germany today. But the first midterm deals with unitary versus federal systems. So far, you've taken a look at two federal systems, the United States and Germany. And we've looked at one unitary system so far with Great Britain. Japan is a second unitary system. So we will talk more about that. The midterm isn't due until next week. All right, when we last left off, I had just finished talking about political parties, and I promised that I would show you a video on the rise of right-wing extremism within Germany. So let's take a look at that.
Welcome back. This year, Germany is celebrating the 60th anniversary of the founding of its democratic constitution. The constitution, of course, marked the end of the Nazi era of Adolf Hitler, and Germany set about shaking off the horrific image created by the Nazis and their atrocities. But today in Germany, the extreme right is being seen as a growing threat to the values laid down in that very constitution. The far-right NPD party, already with members in 2 regional assemblies, the party is aiming now for the national parliament. Unemployment, of course, played a huge part in the rise of Hitler's right wing in the 1930s. Germany today is facing more huge economic challenges. Let's go to France 24's correspondent in Berlin, Damien McGuinness. Damien, tell us first, who are the NPD?
Well, the NPD is Germany's largest right-wing extremist party, and it's the main motivator behind the whole right-wing extremist movement here in Germany. But it has to be said, we're not talking about skinheads in bother jackets and jackboots here. The party has a much slicker image. Over the last few years, it's become much more media-friendly, and you're more likely to see its representatives wearing short, back-and-sides haircut and a suit. So it's a much more subtle and sophisticated approach than we've seen over the last few years.
Damien, stay with us. We'll go now to the special report on this party. France 24 went to the eastern German region of Saxony-Anhalt to meet one of the rising figures of Germany's extreme right.
Michael Schäfer may be young, but he's already one of the hotshots of Germany's far right. Just 26, he's already served on his district council for 2 years and is now standing for election as city councillor in the eastern German town of Wernigerode. Young, slick and media savvy, this is the new face of German far-right extremism. More than happy to court the press, today he's welcomed France 24 to his hometown with events specially designed for the TV cameras. Members of the young right-wing NPD have Germany's other parties in their sights.
I'm here today because Germany can't keep going on like this. The country has lost its social values, and we need a political revolution.
Michael Schäfer first joined a small independent neo-Nazi group when he was 16. Today, it's his responsibility to bring these independent right-wing activists into the main German right-wing extremist NPD party. But his first step is to conquer the town hall.
On the one hand, the NPD is fighting to take over the parliaments. We want to go out into society and win people over. The main aim of the young NPD, on the other hand, is to recruit young people out on the streets, in universities and in schools. We want to persuade them to follow our ideology.
According to figures published in March, 5.2% of 15-year-old Germans say they belong to an extreme right-wing organization. Michael Schäfer may define himself as democratic, but according to the former mayor of Wernigerode, Schäfer is most definitely in the tradition of Hitler's Nazi Germany, as is shown in one of his articles.
The text says we need to get away from the image of being a junior NPD party and get back to a community of fighters out on the streets who can become political soldiers throughout the whole of Germany. Heil Deutschland. For me, that says it all. As far as I can see, that is basically a call to rebuild Hitler's army of stormtroopers.
In Germany, young right-wing activists and all extremist parties are united in one movement, the Volk or People's Front. When Schäfer is with his own people, he shows a very different face, as is the case at this demonstration last December.
Dann leben wir unser Nationalismus eben auf der Straße, so wie heute. Und damit treffen wir sie dort, wo es ihnen wirklich wehtut.
Olaf Sundermeier, co-author of a book on the NPD party, has been following the movement's development for years. His verdict is clear.
For the NPD, a German is not someone with a German passport, but someone who has German blood. That is a racist and nationalistic approach, which has nothing to do with our democracy. It goes against everything which our constitution has stood for since the Second World War.
According to a report published Wednesday by the German Home Office, in the last year, right-wing extremist offences have increased by 15.8%.
That's a special focus report. Let's go back now to Damien McGuinness, who's on the line from Berlin. The face of extremism, Damien, of any side can often be very ugly. What was very noticeable from your report there is that the face of extremism we're seeing there in Germany is very young. Now, obviously, lots of young people are searching for employment. Employment, a big problem in Germany now. How much is joblessness playing a role in what's happening there, just as it did in the 1930s, say, with the rise of Hitler?
Well, I think it's certainly a factor, Mark. You particularly see a popularity of right-wing extremism in poorer eastern areas of former communist Germany, and in a lot of these towns where there's high unemployment and rural depopulation. One of the social factors affecting this is that the young, more educated, mobile young people, particularly young women, are moving to the west to search for work in Western Germany, in Munich or Hamburg, leaving behind the less skilled, the less educated young men. Now, this leads to a lot of problems because on the one hand, they haven't got jobs. On the other hand, they can't find girlfriends. So you've got young, frustrated men who are then turning to comradeship within right-wing extremist parties and feeling like a sense of belonging there.
So a breakdown in the whole social structure there, it seems. Damien, bear with us for a second. Let's go now to an extract from the weekly podcast that Ankel...
Yeah, I want to stop it there. You know, it's easy to kind of dismiss this as by saying, well, these guys just aren't getting enough sex. I mean, that's basically what he's saying, right? All the women in the West, in the East, have decided to move west, and these men are lonely, and they get into this kind of male bonding, comradeship, because they can't find girlfriends. And I know this seems rather silly, but it's not actually, it's not beyond the bounds of reality. As an historian, I can give you examples, for instance. If you want to understand something like the Taiping Rebellion in China back in the 19th century, where 25 million people died in this civil war, one of the reasons why you had this rebellion was because of the gender imbalance in China. As you probably know, for centuries, Chinese parents have preferred to have sons, even to the point of essentially killing their female babies so that they can have another, hopefully, son come along. And what this created back in the 19th century in China was this horrific gender imbalance in which tens of millions of men would never have the opportunity to get married. And it's not just about getting married and having sex. In Chinese culture, it's also about ancestry. If you cannot have children, then no one is going to pray to the ancestors for you. Now, from the kind of Western secular culture we have, you may also find this rather ridiculous, but it's incredibly important in Eastern cultures that you continue to have generations to come so that they will be able to provide for the ancestors up in heaven. This is absolutely essential. Otherwise, you become a pauper in heaven, right? And nobody wants that. You always want to make sure that you have generations to come that will be able to provide you with things during the offerings. So it's not completely crazy what this analyst is talking about here. I'm not suggesting that the reason why you have this far right movement is because these men want to have children that will pray to their ancestors. I don't think that's the case in the West. But there is a social breakdown. That's what you're seeing, a social breakdown. That gender imbalance does create fissures within society. Add to that unemployment, add to that a feeling of disillusionment, of globalization, the same kinds of things that you were reading about in that article on globalization before, on why we see the rise of populism. It's happening in Germany too, among certain sectors. Right? Those who are highly educated, those who are highly skilled, they have benefited from globalization. Those who are not within that category have not benefited. And so they look for scapegoats. They blame outsiders, or in Germany, as they're called, the Gastarbeiten. I'll talk about them in a few minutes. So this is a problem. It's not a huge problem yet. I mean, I think it would be too easy to make it sound like a huge problem, but it is a problem because you do see young people joining this, and not just skinheads, right? As you could see from that video, these are not your typical angry skinhead kind of guy. These are pretty normal, articulate people that are joining this movement. And as I explained to you last week, for many of them, they have found the Alternative for German Party as a mainstream vehicle in which to put forward their extreme views. And that's a danger. I'm not so worried about the NPD. I'm much more worried about the Alternative German Party, because they are putting forward, they are essentially making the kind of far right argument mainstream. And that's a danger. All right, let's finish this up. Germany at the crossroads. So what I've been discussing over the last week are the many positive qualities about Germany's political system and its achievements. But whether Germany can serve as a model for other emerging political systems could well depend on how it meets a series of challenges that it's going to have to face and that it is currently facing. For one, emerging intolerance for foreigners. While Germany has made tremendous strides to try and deal with its racist past, attacks against foreigners and a simmering neo-Nazi movement, as you saw in that clip, continues to challenge the optimistic views that Germany has become a typical parliamentary democracy. Among the most important issue is that of the Gastarbeiten, or guest workers, right? Gastarbeiten, guest workers. Since the 1960s, West Germany encouraged millions of guest workers, mainly from Southern Europe, a lot of them from Turkey, in order to help sustain the booming economy. The one condition was that they had to return to their home countries if the economy in Germany ever turned sour. Well, it didn't turn sour during the 1960s. It continued to boom. And so these guest workers formed families, had children that were born in Germany, and essentially established roots within the country. Now, as the German economy has slowed, it's still growing, but it's not growing like it was back in the 1960s. Many Germans are saying to these Gastarbeiten, time to leave. Well, 20, 30 years later, after you've raised children in Germany, and now you're just told time to go back to Turkey. The article that I gave you that deals with Turkish Germans in Berlin is really an important article. You're going to find this very useful for your second midterm, which, as I said, deals with collective identity. Because the article raises issues about race and ethnicity, about religion, about class. It raises questions among Germans and Turks as to what exactly does integration mean. There's the wonderful example, for instance, of the German teacher grade school teacher, giving gummy bears to their kids, only to realize that this may actually be something that a Muslim child can't eat. This is something she never even considered, right? Because you wouldn't have any Muslim children in an all German class, but now you have children from Turkey. And so this creates not necessarily conflict, it can create conflict, and the article gives some examples of that, but it mainly creates a lot of misunderstanding. And if that misunderstanding continues to fester without being dealt with, then it can lead to conflict. There are hopeful signs. Certainly the article shows there are Germans and Turks that are trying to work together. But by and large, what it seems has happened in Berlin is that you simply have a policy, not a policy, but you simply have a way of life of separation. These are the Turkish neighborhoods, these are the German neighborhoods. Nobody kind of bothers each other. Nobody really integrates with each other. And it seems to work for now in Germany, but that kind of separation can also contribute to misunderstanding, can also contribute to long-term conflict. And what it doesn't resolve is the problem that young Germans, Turks are going through. What does it mean to be German? What does it mean to be Turkish? These are kids, they're now adults, all right? But when I first started dealing with this issue 10 years ago, they were still teenagers. They can't just go back to Turkey. I mean, it would be like saying to me, hey, Dr. Kelly, great news. You can go back to Ireland. Well, I've been to Ireland. Ireland's pretty. I have no desire to live in Ireland. I feel no connection to Ireland, except on St. Patrick's Day. But I'm not Catholic. I don't drink beer. I don't beat up people at soccer matches. So I'm not really Irish, I guess. Any more than these Turks living in Berlin consider themselves to be Turkish. Indeed, they consider themselves to be German, except that German society doesn't consider them to be German. And here's something that we have not yet discussed. Because when we are talking about multi-ethnic and multiracial societies like the United States and like Great Britain, there is no relationship in terms of nationality between race and citizenship, or even ethnicity. Let me use that word, ethnicity and citizenship. To be an American is not an ethnicity, it is a nationality. Your ethnicity may be Irish American or Polish American. Perhaps you see yourself simply as a white American, in which case you shun ethnic identity and you claim a racial identity. And I don't even think that's bad necessarily. I tend to refer to myself as a white American because we do tend to focus so much on race here in the United States. And honestly, I feel really no connection to my ethnic history. In England, of course, to be English is an ethnicity, except to be British is not. British is a nationality. There is no British ethnicity. You are Scot, you are Welsh, you are English, you are Irish from Northern Ireland. So there is no connection there. But in Germany, there is. Because German is not just a nationality, it is also an ethnicity. And we're going to find that to be the case in Japan as well. That's why I think it's so useful to talk about Germany first and then Japan. There's a lot of similarities you're going to find between these two countries. And so collective identity is much more difficult when you are talking about integration, when there is this link between nationality and ethnicity. Now, when we're talking about Germany, race could be a factor here. Certainly, it would be easier for me, a white male, to integrate into German society and for people to think that I was German than it would be for my wife, who is Chinese. Nobody would ever consider my wife German, any more than anybody would ever consider me Chinese or Japanese. So when you have that link between ethnicity and nationality, integration can be much more difficult. It's not impossible, but it is more difficult, particularly when you have the kind of racist past that Germany has. So, citizenship in Germany. Let's see. I told you about that already. Oh, East Germany. I think there's a point on the previous slide I didn't make. In East Germany, this is particularly difficult because the difficulty of integrating East Germany into West Germany economically has been really tough on East Germans. And this was a society, don't forget, it was an authoritarian society. There wasn't even unofficial unemployment before the unification between West Germany and East Germany. And so the far right parties have been most successful in East Germany. Citizenship is also another simmering issue in Germany today. Until 1998, German citizenship was based on blood, that is, ethnicity. If you were German, no matter what country you came from, you were entitled to German citizenship. So if I were born in America and my mother or father or both were German, I could move to Germany and claim German citizenship. And the reason for that is because West Germany wanted to welcome anybody who fled East Germany by promising them automatic citizenship. And so the policy worked for wherever you were. If you were born in Kenya and your parents were German, you could become a German citizen. Well, if you weren't German, you could not. Right? That's the thing. You could not become a citizen unless you were German because it was based on blood. It was next to impossible for non-German citizenships for non-Germans to be naturalized, no matter how long you lived in the country. It was nearly impossible. I mean, and I say nearly impossible because maybe there was an example or two, none that I'm familiar with. Even children of non-citizens born on German soil were denied the right to citizenship. You might be surprised, in fact, that most countries around the world do not have the policy that we have here in the United States. Anyone who is born in the United States, unless you are the child of a diplomat or of a POW, anyone born here in the United States is automatically considered a citizen of the United States, thanks to the 14th Amendment. This is not a policy that most countries around the world have. And until 2000, Germany didn't have this policy either. It now does. In 2000, German citizenship was granted to anyone who was born in Germany. But even with the reforms in place, civil rights for minorities remain a crucial non-economic issue that Germans continue to face.
So what about like the Turkish kids that were born, before 2000? Do they retroactively, or like born in Germany before 2000, did they retroactively get citizenship?
Great question. I don't think that they retroactively automatically became citizens, but I think that they could apply for naturalized citizenship after that. The law did include a process for naturalization. So the picture that I have here of this cute little baby, born on January 1st, this baby was automatically made a citizen because the baby was born after the law had passed. But anyone who was born before the law had passed could apply for naturalized citizenship. Unification also has brought a host of problems to the Federal Republic. Initially, the absorption of East Germany into the West brought great joy for all Americans. When I was traveling in Germany back in 1991, it was just before I started my master's at the University of London. I'd always wanted to see Germany. And so I just decided I was going to take 10 days, bought a German rail pass, and just started going from city to city, talking to as many Germans as I could. And I was talking with one guy at a youth hostel in Berlin. And this was after the unification, just a few years after the unification. And he was complaining about what most West Germans complain about. All these East Germans, they're so lazy, right? They're so rude. They don't understand the importance of work. And so I asked him, do you think it was a mistake? And he said, oh, no, of course not. They're German. Germans should live together. Which kind of scared me because that's what Hitler said about the Sudetenland, for instance. Are they going to start taking over Czechoslovakia again? But I understood what he meant. What he meant was that these are two countries that were separated not by ethnicity, they were separated because of geopolitical conflict. And once that conflict had come to an end, it was only natural that these two countries should come together. That doesn't mean that there haven't continued to be problems. East Germany, which at the time was thought to be the shining star of the Soviet bloc, was just as bad off as all of the other countries were in the Eastern Bloc. That is, horrific pollution, terrible inefficiency, bloated budgets, unskilled workers, lazy workers, because working under a command economy basically meant you don't have to work hard because it's not all about competition. It's just about doing what the supervisor wants you to do. And the supervisor himself was also pretty lazy. Not only that, you then had West Germans coming into East Germany demanding property back that had been taken by the communists when they fled, because a lot of people fled East Germany for the West. And so when the wall came down, West Germans came back in and they said, this house has been in my family for generations, I want it back. So you had property conflict as well. So on the whole, I think Germany seems to be dealing with it well. Certainly I haven't read lately about any major conflicts, but it simmers, right? The West Germans see the East Germans as lazy. The East Germans see the West Germans as arrogant. But, you know, Northern and Southern Californians have that kind of conflict as well. It doesn't mean that we're about to break up anytime soon. We still see ourselves as Californians. I think Germans probably see it the same way. But it has been expensive. A unification tax of 7.5% was put on West Germans in order to try and cover the cost. Nobody likes to pay more in taxes. But to take a look at Berlin today compared to 1991 when I was there, I'm eager to get back to Berlin. I actually have not been to Berlin since 1991, but I have seen pictures of the empty spaces that I was walking through, which used to be no man's land, and it is now shining towers. So it has been tremendous in terms of its growth. Culturally, as I said, there is still a wide gap. One more thing here, because you may find this useful, is in regards to women. West Germans tend to be more conservative than East Germans in regards to women's rights. Remember that the Christian Democratic Union, its motto is all about, you know, church and children and the home. Keep women at home. Now, it's easy to misconstrue. Obviously, Angela Merkel is a woman and is a pretty strong political leader. But the idea is a focus on the family. And so abortion is not illegal in West Germany, but it is difficult to attain. In East Germany, abortions were not difficult. And not only that, you also had surprisingly, greater rights for women under the communist leadership in East Germany than you do under West Germany. And that has created conflict, because what West Germany sought to do was to create a uniform code of all of its laws, totally understandable. But in some cases, this is actually a rollback of rights for women. For instance, in regards to taking time off or childcare or abortion. So not all is well. It would be easy to exaggerate. I don't want to exaggerate, but I don't also want to paint this smooth picture of integration. It has not been easy, even 30 years on. Let's see. Okay, finally then, European integration. With its high wages and generous social benefits, Germany may face more competition through European Union integration as it competes with countries that have lower social and economic standards. Couple that with the enormous cost of unification. German workers also face the prospect of German employers deciding to go outside of Germany as the EU breaks down economic borders in search of cheap labor and fewer state regulations. Now, there are limits to this, because to be a member of the EU means you have to follow a set standard of regulations, health and safety regulations, for instance, worker rights and things like that. But there are differences in pay between, say, Polish workers and German workers. And so if you can find, basically what I'm saying is that you have the same kind of outsourcing in Germany that you do in any industrialized country. Germany has been successful because it is able to create high skilled jobs, but not all jobs in Germany are high skilled or high wages, right? And so if those start to move out, then you're going to face the kind of problems that these young people who are joining the NPD are complaining about. No economic opportunities in this country. Instead, it's going to foreigners. Many Brits, of course, said the same thing. That's what helped to fuel Brexit. Even without European Union integration, the birth rate in Germany is not just slowing, it's actually projected to decline. The German population will get smaller. An older and smaller population will put greater strain on the welfare state and pensions as the population ages. It's also going to increase ethnic and racial conflict if the government decides to open up its borders wider to foreign workers. One example of this already occurring, in fact, was the controversy created back in 2000 when the Schroeder government decided to issue permanent residency status to software specialists from India. We, of course, have the same problems here. Right? We have H-1 visas that allow highly skilled immigrants to come in and take pretty high-skilled, high-paying jobs. And the argument from many on both the left and the right is, how come these jobs aren't going to Americans? And the answer usually is because Americans aren't trained. We don't have an educational system. We don't have a skill training system that the government bothers to emphasize to train Americans to take on these jobs. So it's necessary to pull in immigrants from other countries. Now, I don't think Germany can say that. Germany actually has an excellent training and educational system. It just doesn't seem to be meeting the demand. Now, population, let me say a few more things about this, because this is something that you're going to find really important in Japan, which is why I have made this discussion topic. The discussion topic that you have for Japan is about the low birth rate. And I think there is something different about Japan than there is Germany, because the article that you're going to be reading is basically the Japanese have stopped having sex. And I don't mean the Japanese have stopped having kids. I mean, literally, the Japanese have stopped having sex. And of course, you can't have kids if you don't have sex. So this is contributing to the problem. There are other factors that are contributing to the problem. I don't think that's the case in Germany. At least I haven't seen anything similar to that. In Germany, you seem to have the typical problem of, as the population becomes more skilled, more highly educated, as women enter the workforce, families are having fewer children. This is a problem with every industrialized society. Everyone goes through this demographic transition. The United States is going through this demographic transition. So why isn't the United States population shrinking? Because we have immigration. If we were to literally cut immigration in the way that Donald Trump and his supporters want, you would see a population decline in this country. Now, if you believe that there are too many people living in the world, you may think that's a good thing. Any way to try and decrease population increase would be a good thing. But there are policy ramifications that come with that. As you have fewer young workers, but more older retirees, who's going to pay for their pensions? That's a problem. Now, it's not a problem here in the United States as long as we continue to have immigration. But in countries like Japan and Germany that severely restrict immigration because they don't want immigrants, largely because, again, of this ethnic nationality connection. This is a problem, and it's going to burden the welfare state. It means that you're either going to have to raise taxes on young workers or cut benefits for older people, or the third option is, I think, most realistic. You're going to have to do both. You're going to have to raise taxes and cut benefits because the population is getting smaller. So these are problems to consider. Some of them, again, you're only going to be talking about in your second midterm. for collective identity. But that is all I have to say about Germany. Do you have any quick questions before we jump into Japan?
It kind of seems like, and maybe this is wrong, but it kind of seems like a large amount of Germany's problems just come from unification.
Sorry, it comes from what?
Like the majority, and I could be completely off, but it seems like from the lecture and the reading that the majority of Germany's problems come from the struggles of unification.
Well, in terms of the most obvious problems, economically, for instance, and the kind of cultural conflict you have between Germans, yes. But if we're talking about, say, the Gastarbeiten, if we're talking about, the difficulty of the welfare state and a shrinking population, those are problems that were happening even before integration. So the answer to your question is yes and no. Yes, in some cases, absolutely. Integration has created a lot of problems. In other cases, these are just long-term problems that are finally coming home to roost now.
Right, thanks.
You bet. Anything else? Now, guys, I see that sometimes you type something in the chat. If you're typing it for your fellow students, that's cool. But you need to know I don't read the chat because I can't. All right, in the sense that I'm standing up here giving you a lecture. So if you have a question, the best way is to just ask it, or you can email me, but don't expect me to read your chat. If you're sending the chat out to your fellow students, that's great. I have no problem with that, but I won't be able to read it. So just so you know.
When did Germany join the European Union?
Oh, it's one of the founders. Yeah. So the European Union was, gosh, what, originally created, I think, back in the late 60s, early 70s. And so it was one of the founders there with France, back when it was still the common market. Okay, you ready to go east? You know, one thing I have, whenever I teach this in the fall, depending on which country I'm talking about, I get so hungry for that particular food, right? So we just finished Germany. I'm certain that this weekend I'll probably do an Oktoberfest barbecue. But when we talk about Japan, I just want to go eat sushi. And when we get to Mexico, I love Mexican food. So for me, every week that I'm focusing on these countries is also determining what it is I'm going to be having for dinner that night. Now, throughout the 1970s and 80s, Japan seemed unstoppable as an emerging economic power, destined, some said, to overcome the United States. Now, it's impossible for you young whippersnappers to know, but back when I was a boy in the 1980s, every movie that you saw that focused on the dystopia to come always dealt with Japan. Japan as not the enemy, but Japan as the country that had overtaken the world in terms of technology, in terms of culture, in terms of crime. All right, you take a look at Blade Runner, 1982, Blade Runner with Harrison Ford. Great dystopic movie. And it deals, there's actually no mention of Japan, but Los Angeles, which is the location of this film, is completely infused with Japanese culture. So Japan was seen back in the 70s and 80s as the country that was going to overtake every country in the world. We didn't worry about the Chinese back then because honestly, they were still trying to dig themselves out of the hole of the Cultural Revolution. Japan, that was seen as the up and coming. Its close working relationship between labor and management, its schools, where students ranked among the highest in math and science, its virtually crime-free society, its relatively equitable income distribution, and its political stability were all the envy of the world. American firms and academics searched for the key to this Asian nation's success. CBS News asked, "What's Japan's secret, and can we bottle it?" After World War II, Japan developed an Asian style of democracy. An Asian style of democracy. Japan actually is a great, great case study for all Asian democracies and non-democracies as well, because everyone has used Japan as a model, whether we are talking about South Korea, whether we are talking about Taiwan, whether we are talking about China, whether we're talking about Singapore. They all have taken different roads towards industrialization and democratization, or in the case of China and Singapore, really non-democratization. But they all use Japan as a touchstone, which is why this phrase, Asian style of democracy, is so apt. In the West, democracy emphasizes active citizen participation in the affairs of the state and a competition of interests among political parties and interest groups. It's about participation. It's about competition. Just take a look at the election coming up, 28 days from now. Things are getting exciting now. You've got millions of people that have already voted. Right? The election, we say it's not for 28 days. The election is happening now. Millions of people have already voted, either by mail or by going to their county offices and voting early. Participation, competition. That is the Western style of democracy. In contrast, the Japanese model relies on a passive and compliant citizenry and a monopoly of power held either by one political party or a government bureaucracy. Japan also places far greater emphasis on economic growth and political stability than on citizen participation in government, or even the protection of political and human rights. Those are secondary. Not so in the West. In the West, individual rights. Now, I hesitate to use the word individualism here, although that also is very popular in the West, though we can see some tapering off of it in countries like Germany. But even in Germany, individual rights, civil liberties are very important, considering its Nazi past. In Japan, not so much. Not so much. And this largely actually does have a lot to do with the communal aspect, not just of Japanese culture, but of Asian culture in general. Again, this is why it's so useful to talk about Germany and Japan back to back, because while I have focused on Germany as emphasizing a kind of communal policy goal, Germany still takes considerable importance in protecting individual rights, as do all Western democratic cultures. Eastern cultures, whether democratic or not, have always focused on what's good for the whole. What's good for the group? That is of primary importance, even more important than individual liberties. Whether we are talking about Japan or whether we're talking about China, which of course is not a democracy. But communism in China, I hesitate to use the word because there's no communism in China, but let's go ahead and use the word. The communist government in China justifies all of its actions on the basis of what is good for society as a whole. Japan does the same thing. It places far greater emphasis on that than on individual liberties, and far greater emphasis, therefore, on the economy, because the economy can benefit everybody. The economy can benefit the whole nation. So economic growth, political stability. This is what I mean by the Asian democratic model. A passive and compliant citizenry, monopoly of power by one party or government bureaucracy, more emphasis on economic growth, less on citizen participation. And for Japan, as I said, back in the 1980s, it seemed to be the elixir to success. We haven't heard much lately about Japan overcoming the United States as an economic power, at least not since 1991. When the financial and real estate bubble that fueled the boom of the 1980s finally burst. Japan entered a deep, deep recession. And I don't mean it was a recession for a couple of years. I mean, it was a recession that lasted a decade. wreaking havoc not just on its economy, but its political system. The Japanese literally refer to it as the lost decade because you had negative growth. This is at a time, by the way, that Western democracies are by and large booming. Right? Bill Clinton is elected in 1992 just as the recession is coming to an end. In fact, the Republicans, George Bush Sr., for instance, argued that the recession had already come to an end when Clinton was elected. But unfortunately, Bush didn't get any credit for it. And that's probably true in terms of economic indicators. But what we see happening in the United States in the 1990s is the longest economic expansion in American history up to that time. Right? That expansion has since been superseded by the expansion of the Obama-Trump years. Longest economic expansion. So it's rather amazing that while you have economic growth, big economic growth happening in the United States and in countries like Germany and Great Britain, that Japan is actually falling behind. Since 1989, Japan has gone through at least, honestly, I've lost count. I think I need to change it. 17, 18 prime ministers. I have here written 16, but that was 2 years ago, and I think they've gone through 2 prime ministers since then. 18 prime ministers. Political parties promise reform, but actually do little to enact those promises. And all the while, the public grows more cynical with its political leadership and the direction of the economy, which, as I will show you later with those economic statistics that I emailed you last night, remain incredibly weak, pathetically weak. And then on March 11th, 2011, tragedy struck Japan when a 9.0 earthquake shook off the northeast coast of Honshu Island, which was then devastated by a tsunami that traveled 6 miles inland. I have a clip to show you. I'll come back to this slide. Let me show you the clip first. Okay, such horrific pictures. The statistics were staggering. 15,690 dead, 5,714 injured, almost 5,000 missing. They just don't know what happened to them. Probably swept out to sea. 320,000 people displaced, 235 to 310 billion dollars in damage, not million, billion, up to 310 billion dollars in damage. To make things worse, a 19-mile no-fly zone around Fukushima nuclear power plant was required when the plant went offline after the quake and experienced a partial meltdown. Although the government said there's nothing to worry about, there is plenty of evidence to indicate that radiation leaked and that the surrounding area, in fact, is infected. The effects of the earthquake and the tsunami led to power shortages and stricken factories, and the effects, if any, from the radiation from the nuclear power plant on the island has been left to speculation. So, is Japan down for the count? A once promising nation, relegated to second-class status? Of course not. Right? The answer is obviously no. Despite its economic and political problems, of which there are many, Japan has one of the largest economies in the world, and its firms remain highly competitive internationally. And even with all of its political problems, Japan remains a stable democracy today. In short, the land of the rising sun still has lessons for us to learn from. So, as with all of our countries so far, we begin with the geographic setting. Like Germany, Japan's destiny in the modern era has been in response to its geographic features. Composed of 4 main islands, this 145,900 square mile nation is the 10th most populous in the world, with 126.5 million people. Please, though, note that the population growth is, that's not a typo, that is correct, negative 0.2%. What that means is that the population is in fact shrinking. In fact,
Wait,
when I give
negative
this,
or less than?
it is
That's a
negative.
less than symbol.
It is shrinking by 0.2% every year.
Okay.
Right. So this is the latest figure that I have in 2020. In 2021, demographers expect it to be 2% less. And in fact, it already is less, because when I gave this lecture last year and I updated the number, it was 127 million last year. And last night, when I updated the number again, it had shrunk down by 500,000, 126.5 million. So this is a population that is shrinking. And that is it is having serious implications, social, economic, political, which we'll talk about later. Now, while the water that irrigates Japan and its rice fields is abundant, other natural resources such as timber and oil and metal ores, these are in short supply. Remember I told you that one of the reasons why the United States was able to industrialize so robustly was because it had a continent filled with the resources necessary to do that. Britain had a lot of coal, and it was able to use that coal to industrialize. What it didn't have, it used a colonial policy to attain. Germany had a lot of coal, certainly has a lot of timber. It had more resources than either Great Britain or Japan. But Japan is an island nation. And as an island nation, it obviously is isolated. That can provide some good protections, but it also means that you're limited in what you can get from that island. It's a lot of fish, right? Which is why fish, of course, is such a big staple of the Japanese diet. But when you have other natural resources that are in short supply, and you want to industrialize and become a powerful country, then there's only one choice. At least back in the 19th century, it appeared that there was only one choice. And that's to become an expansionist power. Right? The lack of resources on its island compelled Japan into a policy of imperialist expansion into Asia in the early to mid 20th century. Even today, its lack of resources dictates its import-export trade policy, though it doesn't need gunships in order to become rich. But back in the 19th and early 20th century, that was the prevailing thought, not just in Japan, but also in Europe and also in the United States, which of course is why we ourselves embark on an imperialist crusade in the late 19th century. We kind of wake up from that, but Japan doesn't. Japan, in fact, seeks to conquer the whole Asian continent. More on that. Now, the Japanese monarchy that rules symbolically today was founded in the late 12th century. It is, in fact, the world's oldest monarchy. But is it actually Japanese? Interesting story. The Japanese are very, very proud of their heritage. Indeed, I think there's still a lot of racism today in Japan that is based on that old idea of being descended from the sun gods. And of course, the monarchy had always believed to be descended from the sun gods until back in the 1970s or 80s, archaeologists suddenly were discovering in old imperial grave sites from the monarchy that there were actually Korean artifacts. What did they do? Did they explore this further to determine if the monarchy actually was descended from Koreans? Of course not. They closed up the site. They would rather not know whether their monarchy actually descends from Koreans. That's one problem with the Japanese. In terms of their culture, in terms of their history, rather than explore what the truth is, rather than deal with the reality, they would just rather not know. And the monarchy history is one example. World War II is another. And I'll have more to say about World War II in a minute. Well, even back then, the emperor was a symbol, right? The emperor never really ruled Japan. Instead, Japan was ruled by shoguns, right? A feudal autocracy. The forced opening of Japan by the United States Navy, by Commodore Perry in 1853, 1854, led in part to the collapse of the shoguns as others within the samurai class sought to create a more modern Japan through the Meiji Restoration. Japan had a revolution, but it was not a revolution from the bottom, like what the United States had in its revolution of 1776. This was a revolution from the top. And the revolution was caused by the fact that American gunboats had come into Yokohama Bay in 1853 and said, you are going to open yourself up to trade. Otherwise, we're going to blow you up. And so Commodore Perry said, we'll be back next year for your answer. And so he took his ships out of Yokohama Bay, came back in 1854 and said, well, what's the answer? You're going to open up for trade, or am I going to start firing on Yokohama? And of course, the Japanese, being very wise when it comes to military matters anyway, said, yeah, all right, I guess we'll open up. And what they realized, what the lesson here was that you need to modernize in order to prevent yourself from being dominated. The Japanese thought that by isolating themselves from the West, they would be able to protect themselves. And Commodore Perry proved that ain't going to happen. And in fact, what Japan feared was that it would become another China, a China which was being slowly carved up by European powers coming in and taking off certain sectors like Macau, like Shanghai, like Hong Kong. That's what Japan worried about. And so if Japan was going to prevent that from happening, it had to modernize politically, industrially. That's what the Meiji Restoration is. It is a revolution at the top in which industrialists come together with other elites and they say, we need to modernize so that never again can a power like the United States come in and tell us what to do. So it replaced the shoguns, replaced it with an oligarchy, but it kept the emperor. The emperor, keeping the emperor was essential because this would provide continuity and legitimacy. But the emperor wasn't in charge. Right? The emperor had never been in charge. And it certainly wasn't in charge under the Meiji Restoration. So it had the veneer of a democracy when in fact it was an oligarchy. Well, it was successful. I mean, it did manage to transform the nation into an industrial and military powerhouse. So much so that at the end of the 19th century, Japan was able to prove its military might by kicking Russia's ass in the Russo-Japanese War. And in the process, took the Sakhalin Islands, which, by the way, at the end of World War II was one of the first things that Stalin took back after the Japanese surrendered, and threw the Russians out of Manchuria. And that now became a Japanese-dominated region. Manchuria was never really controlled by the government in Peking. This was always a kind of region that had been controlled by foreign powers. And until the end of the 19th century, it was controlled by Russia. But after the Russo-Japanese War, it was now controlled by the Japanese, who would then eventually change the name to Manchukuo. And there's more history there that you don't really need to know. It's not particularly relevant here, but it is fascinating. Well, in 1889, in response to calls from government dissidents, the government allowed for the creation of a constitution and imperial diet. I don't mean, diet like Nutrisystem. I mean an imperial legislature. It's called the Diet, still is called the Diet, in which the lower house would be elected by adult males based on the amount of national taxes they paid. I don't know what the minimum was, but the idea here was to not open it up to mass democracy, but to keep it limited. But like the Prussian system of government that it was modeled on, all real decision-making power rested with the oligarchy as the emperor's representatives, including the right to rule by decree. So while you had a lower house that gave the veneer of democracy, all decisions were actually made by the oligarchy, who would then take out a piece of paper and have the emperor sign it. And therefore, that's the law. It doesn't really matter what the Diet wants. This is what the Son of God wants. This is what the emperor wants. By 1925, all adult males, though not females, were granted the suffrage. In fact, it wasn't until after World War II when General Douglas MacArthur, wrote the Japanese Constitution, that women finally got the right to vote in Japan. Still, giving all males over the age of 25 the right to vote didn't change anything. The real power structure still stayed within the oligarchy. Well, there we go. Yep. Falling a bit behind there. All right. Nor could these limited reforms withstand the assault from right-wing and military groups who sought to steer Japan towards a more expansionist policy into Asia. We shouldn't be particularly surprised that the Japanese military eventually took over the Japanese government, because in fact, Japanese culture, I wouldn't call it militarized today. Japanese culture, in fact, is quite pacifist. But that's because you had 2 atomic bombs that had been dropped on Japan. Right? That can turn anybody into a pacifist. Prior to World War II, long prior to World War II, Japan had always been a militaristic country. Right? The shoguns that ran Japan ran it on the basis of military might, right, of violence. And so Japan had always been divided into these social classes. You had the shoguns, and then you had everybody else, right? The peasants, basically. And so this kind of militarism of Japanese pride, of Japanese bravery, always in pursuit of glory for the emperor, glory for the nation. But this kind of culture is going to eventually lead to the military itself taking over the government, using as its justification the same kind of justification that the shogun always used, which is in the name of Japanese national pride and security, it is necessary that we have this prominent role. And so after a while, even having the pretend government of civilians didn't matter. Eventually, the military just took it all over completely, right? So that the generals were now in charge. The generals became the ruling oligarchy. They were the ones now signing the papers in the name of the emperor rather than the industrialists. Though the industrialists were still benefiting, right? Because you need to make ships, you need to make guns, and these are all being made by Japanese industrialists. So since the Army and the Navy were beyond the control of the civilian government, they conducted their own foreign policy. Imagine if the Defense Department here in the United States decided that we were going to go to war with Russia. And the President of the United States, who we all know is or wants to be very close to Putin, said, no, that's not going to happen. And the Army said, well, we don't really care what you say, sir, because you're not in charge of foreign policy. We are. That is what the Japanese military did. The Japanese military said, we're going to go to war in China. And the civilian government said, you know, that may not be a good idea. To which the military said, well, we don't really care what you think because we run foreign policy. Throughout the 1930s, civilian leaders who spoke out against the Army were intimidated and or assassinated until finally all political parties were banned in 1941. Japan only embraced full democracy when it was imposed upon the nation by the United States, which, as I said, wrote its constitution. And I'm not kidding when I say Douglas MacArthur wrote the Constitution. He and his aides wrote the Constitution that Japan still uses today. That was a Constitution written, very few changes, very few, written by General Douglas MacArthur, who was the officer in charge of the occupation in Japan. The emperor was officially relegated to a symbolic role. Now, you may be confused because a moment ago I said that the emperor has always been symbolic. True, but the emperor's name was actually used as a way to run the government, right? So that you can have the oligarchy, you can have the military come in and say, well, we are acting in the emperor's name. And since the emperor makes all the decisions, here's the law. That's no longer the case, right? No longer the case. The emperor truly is a symbolic role in the same way that the Queen of England is a symbolic role. I don't think that the emperor even pretends to sign legislation like the Queen does. The emperor is merely a figurehead. Well, we also see labor unions being recognized. Women are given the vote. And the military was dissolved in Japan. Japan, in fact, was required to renounce war. Its constitution officially renounces war. And if Japan wanted to send troops abroad in any kind of military conflict other than a defensive one, it would have to change its constitution. And every few years, there is this debate as to whether Japan should alter its constitution and take that renouncement of war out. Now, although I said Japanese military is dissolved, that doesn't mean that Japan doesn't have a military. It has a damn good military, and I'll talk about that later. Now, Japan's government took an interventionist role in bringing about economic development. Indeed, it used Prussia as its model, both politically and economically. The state sought to work with, rather than against, a powerful collection of corporate empires known as the Zaibatsu, in its drive to create a modernized economy and society. The Meiji government provided direct subsidies and tax breaks and tariff protection against foreign competition, and funded public works infrastructure to facilitate development. The same thing that we see happening in Germany under Bismarck, right? This close coordination between the government and big industrial firms to quickly industrialize the country. This revolution from the top. Japan is following Bismarck's model almost really down to the iron fist and the velvet glove. As the nation grew richer in the early 20th century, there was an extremely uneven distribution of income. and wealth among citizens. The Zaibatsu, squeezing the working class and small businesses, profited the most, as did agricultural landlords who squeezed what they could out of their tenants or peasants, right? Maybe not the kind of peasants that you see in Braveheart, right, from the 16th and 17th century, but essentially they're still peasants, right? They're living on the land as renters, as tenants. As was the case in Germany, the necessity of fueling its industrialization with natural resources that Japan did not have, plus aggressively seeking new markets, propelled the nation into war against its neighbors and eventually the United States. So this economic policy that, again, it was using Germany as a model, moved it into war. Now, there are many ways. I have to be careful here because I could really go off on a tangent. There are many ways that you can interpret World War II. One thing that you always need to be aware is that different interpretations and different theories out there can explain the same event. If you're a history major, you're going to find this. If you're a political science major, you're going to find this. If you take me next semester, if you're crazy enough to take me next semester with international relations, we will talk about war and the wide variety of theories that are out there to explain war. And one theory is that what caused World War II was imperialism. This notion that Japan was looking for more markets. It was looking for natural resources. It was looking for oil. It attacked Pearl Harbor, not because it had any intention of marching its tanks down Pennsylvania Avenue, but because it wanted to keep the United States out of Asia, which Japan wanted to dominate for its markets. And that's a totally reasonable interpretation. Another interpretation would be you take a look at the kind of military leaders that Japan has, or you take a look at militarism and how it eventually would inevitably lead to war. But my point is that there are many different theories. Regardless of which theory you take, however, you must understand that Japan was compelled by this belief that it was going to choke on its own feces and vomit unless it moved onto the continent. That is irrefutable. Now, you can spin a lot of different theories out of that, but the Japanese leadership had convinced itself that at the rate the population was growing, if it did not have the ability to expand onto the Asian continent, it would literally die. And this is why it took such a big risk in bombing Pearl Harbor. The Japanese knew that it was a risk. Of course, they knew that it was a risk. The United States is larger economically, population-wise. In terms of its military, it was weak. But Japan understood that it had the ability to build up a military. So what Japan hoped to do was to knock the United States out before it could even get into the war. That's what the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor was all about. We're going to destroy your fleet and so entrench ourselves in Asia that you will think twice before coming to get us. And you will, therefore, negotiate. That's what Japan wanted. It didn't want to go to war with the United States. It wanted to force the United States into a negotiation, to which the United States said, no way. You just attacked us. We're going to come and destroy you, which we did, right? Because we get really pissed off whenever we get attacked. So, big mistake by Japan, but they knew that it was a risk. They really did. But they looked at it in terms of either we take the risk of losing a war to the United States, or we do nothing and know that the inevitable result will be that we choke on our own vomit and feces. Now, that's a pretty extremist and pessimistic view. Japan certainly has managed to grow economically astoundingly beyond its pre-World War II days without having to go to war. But when you are working from the kind of militaristic culture that Japan was, we shouldn't be surprised that it only saw those two options. How did conditions change in the post-war environment? Well, the democratic reforms imposed on Japan by the US occupation force and the breakup of the Zaibatsu conglomerates helped to reduce the large concentration of wealth. Land holdings of the large landlords were also redistributed to tenants and small farmers, eventually transforming a pre-war source of rural radicalism into a stable block of electoral support for conservatives in post-war Japan. Yeah, as an historian, I just have to say, this is freaking amazing, because at the end of the Civil War, what did the slaves get? Well, they got their freedom, but they didn't get anything else. They didn't get any land. They didn't get their 40 acres and a mule. They got zilch, right? Which of course set up the conditions for whites in the South to dominate African Americans, even in the post-slavery era. So what do we have? We have this Republican by the name of Douglas MacArthur, who is coming in with some pretty radical ideas that says we're going to redistribute land. We didn't even do that in our own Civil War. And yet at the end of World War II, they are redistributing land. And what does it do? It makes Japan more democratic. It helps to ease that unequal distribution of wealth. It absolutely breaks the power of the Zaibatsu and the oligarchies. Japan also benefited greatly. There we go. Japan also benefited greatly from American aid to rebuild the country. And we really can't underestimate that. And that's a huge, huge factor. It was getting economic support. It was getting military support because the United States wanted to ensure that Japan would be a shining beacon of capitalism against, communism in China. And it also wanted to ensure that it would remain safe. And so the United States formed a treaty with Japan in which the United States promised to come to Japan's defense. But Japan did not promise to come to the United States' defense because, don't forget, Japan renounced war. So Japan only has what's called a self-defense force, although its army is pretty kick-ass, right? And so is its navy. There have even been some skirmishes with the Chinese in the last few years over some disputed islands south of China in the China Sea. But this treaty obligation meant that Japan didn't have to focus so much money on its defense. It could focus its resources on its economy. So while we were making shiny new bombers that we can only sell to countries, the Japanese were making TVs and stereos that they could sell to everybody. Access to advanced US industrial technology and wider sources of raw materials that could now be accessed without having to go to war. Merchandise and capital markets that also provided great sources of revenue. All of it fueled its dramatic growth in the post-war period. What Japan learned was that it would actually be more economically prosperous without going to war. But let's also be realistic. Prior to World War II, the world was pretty much divided by trade barriers. Countries simply were not interested in free trade. And so the only way that you could expand your markets really was through colonialism. One thing we learned, certainly, was that that kind of economic policy can lead to war, which is why we see, and it can also lead to Great Depressions, which is why we see an emphasis on free trade from both the left and the right, not just here in America, but really Western democracies, industrial democracies in general. The left and the right come to embrace the idea of free trade. And this benefits Japan tremendously because it now doesn't need to go to war in China for new markets. It has the United States as a new market because there are a lot of people who want to buy Toyotas. And you don't need to go to war with the US to sell a Prius. Well, Japan's economic success, well, certainly people like Donald Trump would say, look at all the money that we gave to Japan. Right? They're ungrateful. It would be easy to exaggerate that it was all handouts from the US, but that would also be unfair to the Japanese because after 1952, the new government initiated a number of industrial policies to provide investment funds and tax breaks and foreign exchanges and basically all sorts of things that I'm going to tell you about when we come back on Wednesday, because I can't possibly tell you all in 30 seconds. So this is a good place for us to end. When we come back on Wednesday, we will pick it up here. We made very good progress today. I give 2 weeks for Japan, mainly because I'm always late with Germany. And there's a lot to talk about with Japan. And I also have a movie to show you next week. Plus, since your midterm is next week, I didn't want to add an extra country because I know you're not going to read the chapter for an extra country if you're working on your midterm. So it just works out better. So these next 2 weeks will be focused on Japan. We'll kind of catch up. And I will see you all on Wednesday. Have a good week.